Did Jesus resurrect?
The evidence for the resurrection is better than proclaimed miracles in any other religion. It's outstandingly different in quality and quantity.
What you just heard was Antony Flew, one of the most prominent atheists of the 20th century, who later became a deist, acknowledging the strength of the evidence for the resurrection. But what if I told you the evidence is strong enough to conclude that Jesus of Nazareth truly rose from the dead and that his identity exceeds far beyond being just a human from Nazareth? Join me as I take a deep dive and explore as many arguments for and against the resurrection of Jesus as I can, while having countless records, assignments, and exams of a 10th grader, and eventually coming to the conclusion, or should I say the correct conclusion, that Jesus rose from the dead. Before we begin, since we are treating this like a journey, I just want to ask you to set aside your views on naturalism or supernaturalism, at least for now. I'm not asking you to ignore everything physics has to say, but let's not make it the only lens we look through. Alright, quick overview. First, are there evidences for the resurrection? Absolutely. Are there evidences against it? Not really.
When you watch or read debates on the resurrection, it's usually the Christian presenting positive evidence for it, while the skeptic tries to either discredit that evidence or argue that it's not convincing enough.
There's also no missing evidence or lack of evidence that we would expect to find if Jesus actually rose from the dead. Now, in most debates, skeptics will ask for physical evidence for an event that took place 2000 years ago. Usually, they don't explain what they mean by physical evidence. And yet, what's surprising is there is physical evidence. Technically, let's talk about it later. So, to prove the claim, let's start at, did Jesus exist? Virtually all historians agree that Jesus was a real man who lived on planet Earth 2000 years ago. This is confirmed by non-Christian sources such as Tacitus in Annals 15.44, which says,
Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus.
And Josephus in Antiquities 18.3, in which he says,
Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man. For he was a doer of such wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the third day.
We also have other sources like Lucian of Samosata, Pliny the Younger, and Suetonius. Tacitus and Josephus also confirm that Jesus died by crucifixion. This is accepted by nearly all scholars, whether atheist, agnostic, or Christian. The crucifixion was public and brutal, like brutal. Early Christians wouldn't have invented such a shameful and embarrassing death for their Messiah. But this is where it gets interesting. Soon after his death, some people claim to have seen him again, alive as the resurrected Jesus, and they even start preaching it. Some of them are the very people that have been defeated and discouraged by his death. But what if Jesus survived? This is a swoon theory or the apparent death theory. First of all, the Romans knew how to kill people. John 19:34 talks about a Roman soldier confirming that Jesus was dead. This theory suggests that a man could survive scourging, crucifixion, asphyxiation, or drowning in your own blood and blood loss, and then roll the stone away, escape the guards, and convince the disciples that he had defeated death. As Wesley Huff says,
if you survive a crucifixion and then you go and you find your disciples, the first thing you say is not, peace be with you. It's get me to a hospital, right?
Are all these resurrection claims just a legend? All the Gospels, written during the lifetime of the eyewitnesses, when people could fact check these claims, report the resurrection. But Paul's letters are even earlier. 1 Corinthians 15:3-8.
For I handed on to you as of first importance what I in turn had received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me.
Scholars agree that this creed predates Paul's letters and even his conversion, and that it originated in the Jerusalem church. Paul says he received it and passed it on to the church at Corinth, and this creed is dated to about 2 or 3 years after Jesus' death and resurrection. This timeline rules out the legend theory. Legends don't form within a few years while eyewitnesses are still alive. Now, this creed also disproves another major theory, but we'll get to that later. Early on Easter morning, some women go to Jesus' tomb to anoint his body, but they see that the stone is rolled away and the tomb is empty. The Gospels vary on what happens next, and skeptics say this makes the accounts unreliable. But in fact, it's the opposite, and well-known atheist Alex O'Connor agrees.
Of course, what a lot of people neglect to consider is that when we're talking about a text as a historical document, contradictions shouldn't make us think that it's less accurate, but more accurate. If historical sources contradict each other, that's evidence of their accuracy.
Different writers might have decided to focus on different points without denying the possibility of others. Also, these seeming contradictions, if compiled correctly, transforms into undesigned coincidences. Renowned Catholic apologist and my favorite YouTuber, Trent Horn, provides a reconstruction of the events that doesn't add or remove any details. In first century Jewish culture, women's testimony was not regarded in courts. They weren't even eligible to testify and were seen as untrustworthy. Keeping this embarrassing detail suggests that the gospel writers were focused on being honest rather than making up stories to make their case. Rapid fire. The disciples stole the body. The disciples were willing to suffer and die for their belief in the resurrection, as we will see later. And no one dies for something they know is a lie. Someone else stole the body. The Gospel of Matthew talks about guards being at the tomb who would have prevented anyone from stealing the body. Even though only one Gospel reports this, the non-Matthean vocabulary and structure suggests that the story was part of an existing tradition. Even without that, if another group stole the body, they would have likely produced it, or at least claimed to have done it when Christianity began to spread, especially to disprove the resurrection claims. There seems to be no historical records of anything like this. Also, why? The Jewish and Roman authorities could have pointed to the right tomb and corrected them. The empty tomb can only be explained by Jesus' bodily resurrection. Now, about the apostles' willingness to suffer death and persecution for their belief. This is called the martyrdom argument, or the liars make poor martyrs argument. Basically saying that people won't die or be persecuted for believing in something they know is a lie. Remember, this argument only proves that the belief is sincere, not that it's true, but it will lead us to the truth. While the Bible directly mentions the martyrdom of only James, the son of Zebedee, and Stephen, other sources, such as Clement of Rome, record persecution and deaths of early apostles. There are many common martyrdom traditions that people know, like Peter being crucified upside down or Andrew being crucified on an X-shaped cross, but these are just church traditions, not recorded in the Bible, so we can't use them to prove mass martyrdoms. But we don't need to. What we need to show is that the apostles were willing to face persecution and risk death, which demonstrates the sincerity of their beliefs. To do that, we just need to establish two things. A, that the apostles preached the resurrection or Jesus' message, which could only be motivated by believing that he rose from the dead. And B, that preaching this message in their historical context could lead to death or persecution. Now, do the apostles have to have seen something to believe in the resurrection? Many people of various religions, including Christians, are still being martyred for their faith without having witnessed any miracle. But modern Christians of today are not in a good position to know if the event happened or not by themselves. However, this wasn't the case for the apostles, who were in a position to know if it was true or not. Unlike today's Christians, the apostles were devastated after Jesus' death, and they needed the resurrection to empower them and validate Jesus as the Messiah. The disciples must have preached the message of Jesus, because if they hadn't, they wouldn't have come to be known as apostles, which means messengers, nor would they have become important figures in the early Christian community. Jesus is also shown commissioning them to preach his message. The book of Acts contains multiple instances of the disciples preaching the resurrection. The disciples must have understood that if they preached the same message as Jesus in the same historical context, then they would also face the same fate as he did. Acts 8:1-3 says,
and Saul approved of their killing him. That day, a severe persecution began against the church in Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered throughout the countryside of Judea and Samaria. Devout men buried Stephen and made loud lamentation over him. But Saul was ravaging the church by entering house after house, dragging off both men and women. He committed them to prison. In the book of Acts, chapter 4, John and Peter are arrested and threatened. In Acts 5, the apostles are put in jail. In Acts 12, James, the brother of John, is put to death by Herod Agrippa, and Peter is also put in jail. It is common to deny these facts, especially the death of James, because it's not corroborated by other documents. It's only from Acts. But Acts is a historical record, and many things in history are only found in one source. These claims aren't anything miraculous or supernatural, so we should have no problem accepting these mundane facts that someone was persecuted or another was killed, just like scholars do. James was killed by Herod in Acts. The text says that his execution pleased the Jewish leadership, and so Herod proceeded to arrest Peter, the leader of the church. The best inference is that James was killed because he was part of the church. Deuteronomy 13:6-18 provides the reason he must have been executed. Since James, the son of Zebedee, died for his belief in Jesus, we can say that he sincerely believed in Jesus and in his resurrection. St. Paul talks about his own suffering that he has received. He says that he has received far more beatings and near-death experiences compared to other Christians. 2 Corinthians 11:24-28. 5 times I have received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I received a stoning. 3 times I was shipwrecked. For a night and a day I was adrift at sea, on frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, danger from bandits, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers and sisters, in toil and hardship, through many a sleepless night, hungry and thirsty, often without food, cold and naked. And besides other things, I am under daily pressure because of my anxiety for all the churches. Tacitus Annals 15.44. The same verse that proved Jesus existed also proves the persecutions Christians faced. Paul himself says he persecuted Christians in Philippians 3:6 and Galatians 1:13. This is proof that Christians were persecuted. James, the brother of the Lord, did not believe in him during the lifetime of Jesus. Mark 3:21 and John 7:5 make this evident. Later, James became a leader in the early church in Jerusalem, as seen in Galatians 1:19 and 2:9 and Acts 15. What could be the reason for his change in belief? Paul states in the Creed, then he appeared to James. It's in the early Creed, within a few years of the event. James was later martyred for his faith. In Antiquities 20.9.1, Josephus records that James was executed by stoning in around 62 AD. James' martyrdom is historically certain. The fact that James, the brother of the Lord, became a leader of the church despite knowing that the same Jewish leaders responsible for the death of Jesus and the martyrdom of James, the son of Zebedee, and the arrest of Peter and John wouldn't hesitate to kill him proves the sincerity of his belief in Jesus. However, James had no initial reason to believe. He was skeptical and possibly embarrassed by Jesus, and his conversion cannot be explained by grief-induced hallucinations. His sudden leadership and death for his faith proves a sincere conviction, one which could only be explained by the risen Jesus appearing to him. Coming back to Paul, his conversion might be the strongest evidence for the resurrection. Paul was a non-persecutor of Christians, mentioned in both his letters and Acts. On the road to Damascus, to persecute and arrest followers of Jesus, Paul encounters Jesus, is blinded, and stays that way until a Christian he was sent to arrest heals him. This story and the radical transformation that followed is described in Paul's own first-hand accounts, making it the opposite of unreliable. Paul later became one of Christianity's most devoted missionaries. He himself explains the reason for his conversion. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared to me also. This experience is not grief-induced or emotional. Paul wasn't grieving Jesus, he opposed him. He had no psychological motivations to join Christianity. He lost status and gained persecution. Paul, more than anyone else, would know what Christians went through, except Christians maybe, and still decided to become one. And we already discussed what he suffered.
Grief-induced hallucinations cannot explain this, nor can guilt, because Paul makes no mention of guilt, internal struggle, or any of his loved ones converting in his writing. His own account remains consistent. A direct encounter with the risen Jesus changed everything. In the psychological origins of the resurrection myth, Jack Kent argues that Paul suffered from conversion disorder, where psychological stress can lead to physical symptoms like blindness, triggered by his guilt over persecuting Christians. But the theory falls short. Conversion disorder is short lived and doesn't explain Paul's lifelong transformation. And again, Paul makes no mention of guilt in his writings. More importantly, Paul would have had to have been one of the most mentally ill individuals in history to suffer from multiple mental disorders such as visual hallucinations, conversion disorder, and auditory hallucinations. Simply put, this theory isn't enough to explain away the conversion of Paul. First Clement, dated between the 60s and the end of the 1st century, written by Pope Clement I, contains this. But not to dwell upon ancient examples, let us come to the most recent spiritual heroes. Let us take the noble examples furnished in our own generation. Through envy and jealousy, the greatest and most righteous pillars of the church have been persecuted and put to death. Let us set before our eyes the illustrious apostles. Peter, through unrighteous envy, endured not one or two but numerous labors, and when he had at length suffered martyrdom, departed to the place of glory due to him. Owing to envy, Paul also obtained the reward of patient endurance. After being 7 times thrown into captivity, compelled to flee, and stoned, after preaching both in the East and West, he gained the illustrious reputation due to his faith, having taught righteousness to the whole world, and come to the extreme limit of the West, and suffered martyrdom under the prefects. Thus was he removed from the world and went into the holy place, having proved himself a striking example of patience. This letter is undeniable proof of Peter and Paul's martyrdom. Bart Ehrman, the agnostic scholar, and Oscar Cullmann shows how clearly the deaths of Peter and Paul are portrayed in this letter. Saint Polycarp, a disciple of Saint John, says the following about Peter and the apostles. They are now in their due place in the presence of the Lord, with whom also they suffered, for they loved not this present world, but him who died for us. This is accepted by Bart Ehrman too. Now, did the apostles have a chance to recant their faith? Even if the apostles couldn't recant, their actions make it clear that they didn't fear death because of their preaching. In fact, it would make preaching more risky and dangerous if there was no chance to recant. However, we do have evidence that the Romans allowed accused Christians to recant their faith. When the 1st century was approaching its end, Pliny the Younger, a governor of Bithynia, asked Emperor Trajan what he should do with Christians who gathered in groups early in the morning. The reply was, "You observed proper procedure, my dear Pliny, in sifting the cases of those who have been denounced to you as Christians, for it is not possible to lay down any general rule to serve as a kind of fixed standard. They are not to be sought out. If they are denounced and proved guilty, they are to be punished with this reservation, that whoever denies that he is a Christian and really proves it, that is, by worshipping our gods, even though he was under suspicion in the past, shall obtain pardon through repentance. But anonymously posted accusations ought to have no place in any prosecution, for this is both a dangerous kind of precedent and out of keeping with the spirit of our age." We have evidence that Christians could recant their faith, but none for the opposite. All of this is more than enough evidence to conclude that the apostles were sincere in their beliefs and were not lying. And accordingly, scholars agree that they were honest about seeing the resurrected Jesus, though they offer another explanation. It may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death, in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. Gerd Ludman. It is a historical fact that some of Jesus' followers came to believe that he had been raised from the dead soon after his execution. Bart Ehrman.
I know in their own terms what they saw was the raised Jesus. That's what they say, and then all the historic evidence we have afterwards attests to their conviction that that's what they saw. I'm not saying that they really did see the raised Jesus. I wasn't there. I don't know what they saw. But I do know, as an historian, that they must have seen something.
That was Paul Fredrickson, an American historian and early Christianity scholar, in a documentary. The skeptical view is that the disciples had certain experiences that made them believe that Jesus had risen, but not necessarily the appearance of Jesus himself. Could this be due to them being sincerely mistaken? perhaps confusing something or someone else for Jesus? Well, I'll let an atheist refute that. Imagine spending every single day with this person, living with this person, eating with this person, and then you've only seen him a few days ago. And somehow, imagine somebody managed to convince you that they were me. Even if I had a twin brother, they probably wouldn't be able to convince you that it was me. The twin theory comes from the Gospel of Thomas, which was written 1 or 2 centuries after Thomas' death, and there is not much historical evidence for it. The Acts of Thomas is also a 3rd century Gnostic document. Thomas being called the twin doesn't make him the twin of Jesus. It just means that he could be a twin of anybody else. We have 4 historical documents about Jesus that makes no mention of a twin. It's also said that Jesus' brothers didn't believe in him during his ministry. The main issue is that this twin Thomas is said to be the Apostle Thomas, which would create very confusing situations. For example, the apostles would have known if Thomas was Jesus' twin, which would make them not believe in the resurrection. Also, Jesus and Thomas appeared together after the resurrection, and twins can't fly, so the twin theory doesn't explain the ascension of Jesus. And even if there was a twin, it wouldn't work, as Alex O'Connor says. No one would come up with a plan this bizarre, where one twin dies and the other impersonates him to convince people that he had resurrected, with no guarantee of personal benefit, success, or even survival. Any other comparison to sightings of Bigfoot or Elvis Presley is disanalogous, because there's a difference between several people seeing, eating a meal with, and touching a dear friend of theirs alive again together, and scattered reports of people catching a glimpse of something in the woods.
Thanks to Melly G.7543 for those words.
People were primed to see Bigfoot because of the movies and documentaries at the time. However, the disciples were not expecting their Messiah to die and resurrect 3 days later. The idea of a resurrection before the end times was foreign and unheard of to them. The Gospels say that the disciples did not understand Jesus' predictions and lost hope after his death. People who saw Bigfoot received positive attention and reinforcement. But you know what happened to the disciples when they preached the resurrection. Bonus: the prophecies about the Messiah are abundant in the Old Testament. They were written centuries before Jesus, yet they align remarkably well with his life, especially the book of Isaiah. A very interesting fact about Isaiah is that we have an ancient manuscript of it among the Dead Sea Scrolls, which date from around 150 to 100 BC. In fact, the Great Isaiah Scroll contains the entire book of Isaiah and shows that the text Christians refer to today was already in existence before Jesus' birth and is almost completely identical to the modern copies. Isaiah 53 predicts Jesus' death and resurrection precisely, and Jesus himself foretold his death and that he would resurrect in 3 days in John 2:19 and Matthew 12:40. Okay, so I talked about physical evidence. Let's go to 1354, when a very mysterious cloth was found in France. It was presented by a knight named Geoffrey de Chauny to the dean of the church in Lille. He claimed that it was the burial shroud of Jesus. Now we know the shroud dates back 2000 years to the time of Jesus. We believe that the burial cloth belongs to Jesus because the wounds in the image correspond with what we know about the Roman crucifixion, including the details of how Jesus was crucified. Theologian, historian, and author of Body of Proof, Dr. Jeremiah Johnston explains that 102 academic disciplines have spent over 500,000 hours studying this artifact and found it to be authentic. Now, in Jesus' appearances after his resurrection, he is described as glowing, and the image in this shroud is formed because of a light. He claims that according to scientists, the image was formed by 34,000 trillion watts of energy in 1/40th of a billionth of a second, and that this is the moment of the resurrection. Scientific studies show the image is superficial. If you get more than 8 feet near to the image, it disappears, something science has not been able to reproduce. The image's formation remains unexplained. Now, the big question: were the apostles hallucinating? Well, let's look at what the word hallucination means. Here's the Wikipedia definition of a hallucination. A hallucination is a perception in the absence of an external stimulus that has the compelling sense of reality. Now, does the appearances of Jesus to the disciples match with the definition of a hallucination? In the Gospels, there are at least 12 appearances of Jesus after the resurrection. The Gospels and Paul report multiple appearances across various settings to different people, including Mary Magdalene, Peter, the 12, and 500 people at once. Skeptics like Alex O'Connor argue that there's a gradual or legendary development of appearances in the Gospels.
O'Connor also claims that the Gospel of John, being the most distant from the source, is the least reliable. However, even if we completely exclude John, there are still plenty of appearances in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. In these appearances, it's not just a single apostle saying, "Oh, it's Jesus." The apostles have very tactile and interactive experiences with Jesus involving physical interaction, such as eating and extended conversations. These experiences involve multiple people at once. Also, Luke 24:50 to 53 and Acts 1:9 to 11 both report the ascension, where Jesus visibly rises into heaven. Matthew 28:16 to 20 reports the Great Commission. Most of the disciples, if not all, must be present in these situations. These group appearances challenge the hallucination theory because group hallucinations are not a thing. Group hallucinations contradict what we know about the nature of hallucinations. By definition, hallucinations occur in an individual's mind and cannot be shared by multiple people. Moreover, Paul's Creed, written within a few years of the event, already states that Jesus appeared to all the disciples and 500 people at once. And the hallucination theory cannot account for James, the brother of the Lord, and Paul's conversion. So, this is not really what most atheists or skeptics believe. They suggest that the resurrection belief began with a few individual hallucinations, experienced only by a few apostles, which can be explained psychologically. Now, in rebutting this, I love how the infographics show puts this. The odds of all disciples, at least enough to jumpstart the Christian church, all suffering from grief-induced hallucinations, are astronomically small to the point of absurdity. Another key point in rebutting this line of thought is what the Jewish scholar Pincus Lapide writes in his book, The Resurrection of Jesus, A Jewish Perspective. If the defeated and depressed group of disciples overnight could change into a victorious movement of faith, based only on autosuggestion or self-deception, without a fundamental faith experience, then this would be a much greater miracle than the resurrection itself. Even if you grant all of that, it still doesn't make sense that the apostles hallucinated seeing a risen Jesus. Even today, when people have hallucinations of a buried person, they usually think that the person is in heaven and okay. Why wouldn't the apostles think that Jesus was in Abraham's bosom or reigning in heaven, especially considering that they were Jews? Jews believed that the resurrection would happen at the end of time, when all the righteous would be raised together. The idea of a single person resurrecting in the middle of history was completely foreign to them. And hallucinations can't create something new. They are shaped by what the brain already knows. So the apostles, being Jews, would never have hallucinated a resurrected Jesus, or they would not have interpreted it as a resurrected Jesus. Today, when people have hallucinations, they usually think that it's a ghost. So why didn't the apostles think that it was a ghost also? Considering the fact that when they saw Jesus walking on water, they thought it was a ghost. Okay, now we have disproven all alternate explanations for the raising of Jesus. The resurrection is proven now, or is it? Skeptics of Christianity still argue that the natural explanation, that is, group hallucinations, are still more probable because the resurrection is a miracle or it's against the laws of physics. One version of this argument, held by skeptics such as Bart Ehrman, is that the resurrection is a miracle, and by definition, miracles should be considered the least probable explanation. Therefore, despite any issues the natural explanation might have, the supernatural or miraculous claim that Jesus resurrected should be the most improbable. Miracles do not happen, and that gives us a statistic unfavorable to the resurrection. This argument is subtly circular, considering the fact that one reason miracles are considered to never happen is because miracles are the least probable, according to the argument. Therefore, miracles don't happen because miracle claims are false, because miracles are improbable, because miracles don't happen. Wait, let's take a step back. Why are miracles improbable? Because they are supernatural. So one has to presuppose naturalism to use this argument. Remember what I said in the beginning? Also, saying that billions of people have not resurrected, therefore it is improbable that Jesus resurrected, is like saying that billions of people did not step on the moon, therefore the moon landing did not happen. Here is a clip of who's considered to be the best atheist on the topic.
If you meet someone in the street who you yesterday saw executed, you can say either that an extraordinary miracle has occurred or that you are under a very grave misapprehension. And David Hume's logic on this, I think, is quite irrefutable. He says, what is more likely, that the laws of nature have been suspended in your favor and in a way that you approve, or that you've made a mistake?
Both Bart Ehrman and Christopher Hitchens are saying that no matter the evidence, the sheer magnitude of this event, that is the resurrection, makes it more probable that you made a mistake or that there are some other explanations besides the resurrection. But the problem here is that if one believes in this argument, then no amount of evidence will ever be able to convince them that Jesus resurrected. So even if all 8 billion people of today witnessed the resurrection, and some even caught it on video, according to this argument, no matter how many problems the natural explanation may have, it could be that it was mass hysteria, false memories, and hallucinations, and that the videos were AI generated or something. This incoherent and inadequate explanation would still be more probable than the resurrection. That's the problem. It's not saying that the resurrection did not happen, it's saying that the resurrection must not happen, no matter the evidence. Coming back to the original version, here's my favorite atheist on the topic.
This sort of process of elimination is very clever, and that's how it's usually run, but it can go the other way. I mean, imagine I were trying to prove that there was such thing as a group hallucination. I know it's extraordinary, but there was a group hallucination. And I tried to prove it by saying, well, what are the other explanations? Or maybe they lied. Well, they wouldn't do that because they wouldn't go to death. Or maybe a man rose from the dead, but come on, that doesn't happen. That breaks all the laws of physics. So the only remaining option is this. Kind of depends where you start. But it is weird. Something very strange seems to have happened on that morning.
Alex O'Connor's argument dodges the counter-arguments I made earlier because he keeps it very specific rather than addressing the miracles and natural explanations in general. He argues that just as we rule out group hallucinations by saying they make no sense, we can likewise rule out the resurrection by saying it goes against the laws of physics. Saying that the resurrections don't happen and so it's improbable doesn't make sense, because it's precisely the fact that resurrections don't normally happen that makes the resurrection of Jesus significant. However, Alex O'Connor argues by saying that it's against the laws of physics. But then again, that is what enables the resurrection to prove supernaturalism. But here's the problem. Even if we steelman the hallucination theory by granting the possibility of group hallucinations, it still doesn't explain the apostles' experiences. As I said, it makes no sense for the first century disciples to hallucinate a resurrected man. But hey, let's just say it was group hallucinations. And I acknowledge that the resurrection is also strange like group hallucinations. So the two leading explanations for this phenomenon that happened 2000 years ago are group hallucinations and the resurrection. Both seem strange from our current perspective. But I ask you, which makes more sense? Both are unusual, yes, but there's a key difference. Group hallucinations are strange, with no cause or explanation. But the resurrection, on the other hand, while it may be strange, it fits into a broader claim. It has an explanation that Jesus is who he claimed to be and that a loving God exists. So there's something happening in this argument too. It treats the resurrection as if it's just some random, unexplained event, ignoring the theological background entirely. But unlike the group hallucination explanation, which offers no deeper cause beyond group hallucinations exist, the resurrection is not a standalone event. It can be explained if the Christian God exists. Let me put it differently. If you reduce each argument to what it's ultimately pointing toward or its explanation, we're not comparing hallucination to resurrection. We're down to the Christian God versus group hallucinations. Now ask yourself, which of these better account for the data? Which aligns better or doesn't contradict our understanding of physics or biology? Is it the idea that multiple people simultaneously experience the same hallucination, a contradictory phenomenon, or that the Christian God exists and acted in history? An omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent God is not just supported but suggested by physics. Wait a minute, but group hallucinations still do not explain how the Jewish disciples saw a resurrected man, and it doesn't explain the conversion of Paul and James. And yet, it's still an inadequate theory, nor is it possible. So the evidence for our Lord's resurrection is so strong that we don't even need the strongest evidence nor the strongest version of the less strong evidence to make the natural explanation look nonsensical and weak. Should you trust that something defined as a perception in an individual's mind was somehow shared across multiple people, multiple disciples, all of whom supposedly hallucinated something their brains were not expecting and were transformed from 11 discouraged men into powerful preachers, and that a man who opposed the figure would hallucinate that figure speaking to him, leading to his radical conversion, loss of status, and lifelong persecution, and that someone who didn't believe in that figure would become a leader in his church and eventually be martyred for him? Or should you trust the man who lived 2000 years ago, who was seen as a godly man and was claimed to have performed miracles, whose death and resurrection were predicted by himself and by prophets centuries earlier, whose followers willingly suffered and died, proclaiming that he had risen from the dead, and that the man was who he claimed to be, and that he rose from the dead. By the way, before we say our goodbyes, I want to appreciate you for sticking around. By now, I hope you have accepted, or at least started considering, that Jesus did resurrect. I know I sounded like an expert in this video, but most of this is what I found on the internet, mainly YouTube. I got a lot of information for this video from the Council of Trent channel, so I'd really love you to check it out if you have seen this video but haven't seen his content yet. What I meant with this video was to have that one video on YouTube that counters almost every argument against the resurrection to help solidify that truth. And I hope I did a decent job at that. And yeah, the normal subscribing, liking and sharing part, you know what to do. And you can buy my poetry collection Non-Fantastical for less than $2 or 150 rupees. Link is in the description. Anyway, given all we have seen, the willingness of the disciples to die for what they saw, and the impossibility of mere hallucinations, the only reason left is that the tomb really was empty, and the man who was in it wasn't just a man. He has risen. I'll see you later, and God bless. Thank you.